Well, hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Dan Levin, and this is Essential Questions. Every year in my confirmation class with 10th graders, I begin by asking them what they think is the most important question Jews ever ask. And we get lots of brilliant answers. What is the meaning of life? How do I know if I'm good? Can I go to the bathroom? But for me, the most important question we ask ourselves as Jews is, what do I do now? To me, that is the most fundamental question there is in Judaism. Judaism begins with a people, a clan that grows into a nation, who chose to accept an invitation to build a relationship with the One, the Creator of the universe. That God delivered them from oppression to freedom, from servitude to a man who thought he was a God, in order that they might choose service to the one God, the source from whom all blessings flow. Together they established a covenant, an agreement to last for all time. And that marriage came with mutual responsibilities. In exchange for a life filled with light, understanding, holiness, and peace, all the things that maximize our experience of human existence, we were asked to live our lives in accordance with a very particular set of commandments, laws that would guide nearly every step we would take in the course of a day, a week, a month, a year, a lifetime. And that law was called halakha, coming from the root halach, how we go, how we walk. Throughout our history, we debated what it was that law demanded. We might not have agreed on what was required, but we always agreed that we had to abide by those requirements, and that to deliberately refuse to follow the law was an act of sin. But something changed in the modern period. We began to understand other fundamental truths, that if we really believed that humanity was created in God's image, then that meant every individual life was of infinite and equal value. And that meant we needed to accord human rights and dignity equally to women and men, to Jews and non-Jews, to people of different races and ethnic backgrounds and sexual orientations, and more. We also began to understand that if we truly valued freedom, then that meant we had to champion the autonomy of the individual, the right of every individual to do what they knew in their hearts to be right. We learned that the commanding voice we needed to listen to was the one that called out from inside us, not that made demands from the outside. And we also learned that to integrate those truths into our Jewish tradition, we would need to make reforms that would change the nature of our prayer book, our practice, the architecture of our synagogues, and the architecture of our lives. And thus was born Reform Judaism. Because Reform Judaism located the commanding voice of God inside each individual, and not from the outside through the compulsions of a rabbinic hierarchy or communal compulsion, the freedom to reinterpret Judaism led Jews away from traditional halakha. The Pittsburgh platform of Reform Judaism in 1887 noted, "We recognize in the Mosaic legislation," and by the way, Mosaic is not dealing with little tiles, it's talking about Moses, "a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. And today, we accept as binding only its moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization." But as time went on, we have wrestled with this question of, can you really be a Jew without halakha? If everything is in bounds, is there ever a boundary? Can we delineate not only what is Jewish and what is not Jewish, but can we delineate what is right and what is wrong? As Rabbi Ami Hirsch recently said, principles require parameters. Beliefs require boundaries. And so the question that we want to ask ourselves today is, what do I have to do? And what is the intersection between Reform Judaism and halakha? And our guest today, Rabbi Dr. Washofsky, described himself as a Reform rabbi who is in love with the rabbinic halachic literature, convinced of its abiding relevance to us and committed to its study. Rabbi Washofsky served as the Solomon B. Freehoff Professor of Jewish Law and Practice. He is an distinguished ethicist of the Reform movement and a beloved teacher and mentor to many generations of students at the HUC JR, Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, where he served on the faculty until his retirement at the end of 2021. He has been associated with the Hebrew Union College for more than 5 decades, having received his rabbinical ordination in 1980 and his PhD in 1987, and served on the faculty of HUC since 1985 until his retirement. Dr. Washofsky specializes in the literature of the Talmud and Jewish law, and has imbued students not only at HUC, but adult learners in the larger Reform movement with a deeper understanding of how Jewish tradition responds to contemporary issues. He chaired the responsive committee of the Central Conference of American Rabbis from 1996 to 2017, and recently published a book called Reading Reform Responsa, Jewish Tradition, Reform Rabbis, and Today's Issues, the most recent of his many publications on the subject of the intersections of Jewish law and Reform Judaism. And so, Mark, it's a pleasure to have you with us on Essential Questions today.
Well, Dan, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that introduction, both of me, which was very lovely, and of the topic, which I think puts very well the choices that Reform Jews have to make when it comes to determining their relationship to the tradition and to their own power of making decisions on their own.
So, Mark, tell us a little bit about you and your journey to the Reform rabbinate and what led you to then study for a PhD in halachic literature and to devote your life to exploring this question of halakha and Reform Judaism.
I was born in New Orleans. I grew up in a small town in South Louisiana with a very small Jewish community. And it was there that I developed a sense of my difference vis-a-vis the people around me. And that sense of difference and exploring who I am, what my identity might be, why am I different, and what is significant about that, ultimately led me to choose a life in the rabbinate, which to a young person at that time seemed to be the best way to work out these issues and to live a satisfying Jewish life. Before I entered rabbinical school, I was asked by my Hillel rabbi at university, well, if you want to be a rabbi, maybe you want to study some text, but just to get you ready for what you're going to do at rabbinical school. And I knew a little bit of Hebrew at the time. I really couldn't read and translate text very well, but I said, yes, sure. I want to see what this is like. And we sat down and I watched this rabbi. We read some Mishnah, which, and he led me through the pointed text in the middle of this traditionally printed page. And then I noticed him going off the side of the page, looking at the strange print on the margins, the strange font in which the commentaries are presented. And he started reading those commentaries, applying them to the text in the middle of the page, and sometimes talking with and back to the commentary himself. And that fascinated me no end, this idea that there's this conversation going on that started 2,000 years ago with the Mishnah, continued through the Middle Ages, that's represented by the commentary, picked up and brought to fruition right here, right now, where we were sitting with a live student of the text, reading, thinking, challenging, arguing. And I knew at that moment, I have to do that. I have to get into those texts. I have to figure out how to do this on my own. I discovered as I studied Jewish tradition, Jewish history, that it was the rabbinic literature, the literature of the sages who flourished some 2,000 to 1,500 years ago. That's the literature that really created Judaism as the religious civilization we know today. That their literature is what turned the Bible, which was this piece of ancient Israelite law and lore, into what really is a Jewish book. They translated the Bible into something Jewish and something that we recognize today. It was their literature, the Mishnah, the Talmud, that I wanted to specialize in. And the more I got into that literature, the more I realized that what rabbis have been doing for all these centuries, ever since their progenitors, the rabbis, the sages, the rabbis with a capital R, I like to call them, what rabbis have been doing ever since is taking those books, the Talmud especially, and trying to apply those teachings to the questions of everyday Jewish life. Judaism became a culture of interpretation where the community turns to a set of agreed upon texts. We all go back to those texts to try to figure out who we are and what we're supposed to do. And then we derive meaning from them. And we do that through a process of argument, because we don't know what the answers are until we turn to the text. And the texts don't always tell us explicitly how we're supposed to answer the questions we have. And so through argument, sometimes with each other in the room, sometimes through literature and response to literature, we come up with understandings of the text to make those texts apply to the questions we have. And that is the process that I found so fascinating, I fell in love with. And not to make a long story even longer, but that's what I'm doing here.
And I think in some ways that process is so mystifying for so many modern Jews, because they take a look at all of the different typefaces on that book and they say, that's not my language. And I don't get it. And so what I've loved about what Judaism has sought to do, and specifically what Reform Judaism has sought to do, is to take these ancient texts and say, no, these are books about you and about the questions that you ask about how to live a meaningful life, about the moral dilemmas that you face, about the questions of meaning and purpose that are at the root of all of our journeys. And I think for me, I can remember that same excitement that you described the first time I sat with a rabbi who opened a book and who offered me the opportunity, like you described, to be part of that machloket, to be part of that conversation, that dialogue, that argument, and to step into that stream was just so exciting. Because all of a sudden, these dusty books that people had told me were so important, were so holy, suddenly became vibrant and alive and accessible and meaningful. And so I can appreciate that same sense that you describe of being so turned on by what your Hillel rabbi did, and have that try to push you along and inspire you and excite you in the same way, because I had the same kind of experience also kind of in that college period. You had once said, I have always regarded it as a mitzvah to identify and nurture the connections between Reform Jewish practice and the halakha, which you said is the authentic source of all Jewish practice, including our own. So tell me why figuring out those connections between what we choose to do as Reformed Jews and what the halakha has evolved to demand and to explain over the centuries, why is that a mitzvah to identify that?
First, I suppose we should define mitzvah, which is a problem in and of itself. But I would say in this sense, a mitzvah is an activity, practice, without which I cannot imagine my Jewishness. That is something that's just essential to who and what I am as a Jew, something I just can't do without.
So a mitzvah is not just, oh, you did a mitzvah, it was a good deed.
Well, you can say that's a mitzvah too, but in the quote there, I think what I'm talking about is this is something we have to do if we want to be authentically Jewish. So what does it mean to be authentically Jewish? and sometimes words like authentic, authentically, authenticity, them's fighting words in the Reform movement, because if we bring it up, sometimes people will think, well, you're criticizing me. Who are you to tell me I'm not authentic? And so I'm not in the business of trying to define specifically what that means. But if it means anything, authenticity means your Judaism has to be rooted in the historic Jewish tradition. We're not making this stuff up as we go along. With all of our freedom, creativity, and innovation, we have argued in Reform Judaism that what we are doing is carrying on tendencies, principles, and ideas and practices that are traditionally Jewish. We are part of the tradition. We don't stand outside of it. That's what makes us authentically Jewish. And how Jews have developed their Judaism throughout the centuries has been through this process of interpretation, or as I sometimes like to call it, translation. An interpreter is a translator in the sense that the interpreter takes the original text and casts it in a language that a contemporary audience can understand. And the interpreter says, look, what I'm telling you is what the text is really saying in different words. I'm giving you the meaning of the text in a new language. That's what Jews have always done. So if we're going to be authentically Jewish and reform and liberal and progressive at the same time, we need to be able to express our Judaism as the fruit of a process of interpretation, of wrestling with the texts of Torah, just like Jews have always done.
So it always demands then an investment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's so many people who would say and define themselves in some ways as Reform Jews. They may not have a Shabbat practice. They may observe a few of the holidays. Maybe they come or maybe they don't come to a high holiday service. Maybe they light Shabbat candles every once in a blue moon, or Hanukkah candles. Maybe they put a mezuzah on the doorpost of their house or sit down for a quick Passover Seder. But they would tell you, I'm so proud to be Jewish. And what I'm hearing you say is that's good, you should, but you need to then demand of yourself a deeper investment, which says you kind of have to explore some of the have-tos and some of the you can'ts that Judaism has explored through its texts, and you can't just leave that on the shelf, so to speak.
Wherever one is in one's Jewish practice, to be serious about Judaism and Reform Judaism, one needs to think about it. One needs to critically examine one's own state of practice and ask oneself, well, am I doing everything I can do? Am I missing the sense of significance and meaning in a number of the practices that I simply have never considered? Perhaps I ought to think about that. Engaging in that process of self-analysis and a call to interpretation, to confront the text, the tradition, and to be part of that ongoing process of thought. That's what it means to be a serious and, I think, authentic Jew and Reform Jew.
And at the same time, though, I think sometimes the law as it evolved itself becomes a stumbling block for meaningful spiritual engagement with Jewish practice. Sometimes I think we as Jews begin to engage in a different form of idolatry, which is we worship the book, as opposed to trying to discern what it is that the author of that book, the Holy One, was trying to teach. And so I often think about, for example, like Shabbat observance. And if you look in the Mishnah, there are 39 different categories of work that we're told we may not engage in. We can't thresh, and we can't sow and winnow or tie knots or tear or light a fire, or all kinds of different prohibitions. And when we think about sort of what it is to live a life as a Reformed Jew, I always sort of think about that Mishnah, Because it would seem to me an Orthodox Jew says there are 39 things you can't do them. For example, if you think about driving in your car on Shabbat, if you don't have an electric car and you have a good old combustion engine, every time you turn on the ignition, a spark plug goes in one of your cylinders and you light a little fire. So an Orthodox Jew says you can't use your car on Shabbat because you can't light a fire. Conservative Jew says, well, yeah, you can't light a fire, but no one ever really imagined that people could live 20, 25 miles away from each other and still think of themselves in the same community. And so if you need to use your car to get to synagogue to pray with your community on Shabbat, that's fine, but you shouldn't use your car for anything else. And a Reform Jew might look at that and say, well, the Torah teaches us to keep Shabbat and make it holy, and that Shabbat is supposed to be simultaneously a remembrance of the works of creation and the glory of the Exodus from Egypt. And so if I spend all day in a windowless office sitting in front of a computer screen, for me, maybe the best way to observe Shabbat might be to go garden and to get my hands dirty in the earth. Now, if I go out and garden, I'm going to violate probably 7 different prohibitions by tying tomato plants or digging or planting or whatever it is I might be doing in my garden. But that, because of the way I would interpret or translate the tradition to my contemporary experience, is a more authentic expression of Shabbat than maybe following these traditional laws. So my question is, as someone who spends a lot of time studying halakha, how does a Reform Jew translate halakha in an authentic way so that you haven't abandoned the spirit of what that law was trying to demand of you, but at the same time, it is in a language that speaks to us in our day-to-day?
Part of the answer is clearly a historical one. Here we are in the 21st century. We Reform Jews are heirs of a Reform Jewish tradition that long ago now, in the 19th century, simply did away with the sense of the idea that we were obligated to the traditional system of Shabbat prohibitions. This is the way we are now. For generations and generations, we Reform Jews have looked upon those prohibitions as really saying nothing to us, except that sometimes they do. Reform Jews still have a sense that Shabbat is a different day, and there's something about Shabbat that sets it apart from the other days, and which means that we ourselves, if we're serious about observing Shabbat, need to act in a different way on Shabbat than we do the rest of the week. Rabbi Solomon Friedhoff, who really was not the founder of the Reform Responsa enterprise, he was not the first Reform rabbi to take halachic or Jewish legal literature and apply it to questions for Reform Jews, but he certainly wrote more Responsa than anybody else. He flourished in the middle of the 20th century, wrote hundreds and hundreds of Responsa. When he turned to questions of Shabbat observance, he said quite clearly, we understand that the old prohibitions no longer make that same demand upon us. But at the same time, he acknowledged or recognized or pointed to or argued the existence of something that he called the Reform Sabbath mood. That is to say, a way in which Reform Jews organize their lives according to how they understand or interpret the demand that Shabbat places upon us. We have our own sense of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate to do on Shabbat. And this mood, of course, is linked to the traditional prohibitions in a number of ways, but is separate from them. So Friedhoff said, let's work with that. Let's work with the recognition that we already understand there is a Shabbat and that it has to be different than the other 6 days of the week. So when it comes to the individual Reform Jews, one thing for communities to make decisions, they have different considerations they have to make, but an individual in their own home, their own life, an individual will have to take a look at the tradition and ask themselves, all right, what are these prohibitions telling me to do? These prohibitions essentially are telling me to abstain from all manner of productive activity, all manner of activity that changes the face of the natural world for my benefit. That's the kind of thing that all those 39 prohibitions seem to be aimed at. Then the individual takes that principle and says, okay, so what does that mean to me? How do I set aside productive activities and fill the remaining time with activity that renews me personally, emotionally, spiritually? And at that point, the individual makes choices. And I think the individual can argue, once they've done it that way, that I'm doing this in the spirit of the laws of Shabbat, in accordance with what Rabbi Freehoff called the Reform Sabbath mood, understanding that there is on Shabbat a sense of, not just a sense of thou shalt, the positive activities, the rituals we perform at the table and in synagogue to sanctify the day, but the sanctification of Shabbat also involves some sort of thou shalt not, some sort of abstention from activities that I would normally do were it not the Sabbath. That's really the process of how a serious Reform Jew might develop a Shabbat practice for themselves.
So, in thinking about that, we think about the 10 Commandments. You shall not murder. You can't, right? We feel obligated by that. It's not a suggestion that you shall not murder. You shall not murder, right? You shall not steal. You shall not commit adultery. This doesn't mean that people don't violate these things, right? But I think there's a general consensus that these are things that really obligate us. And then you get to something like Shabbat, which is also listed in the top 10. And it's kind of like, oh, isn't it nice? We had Shabbat. There is in the introduction, I had the privilege of writing my rabbinic thesis with Rabbi Eugene Borowitz, whom you quote. And he writes, and I can just hear his resonances as he would have said it. I am regularly exasperated by an American Jewry that, wallowing in freedom, prates piously of the sanctity of personal choice and uses it mainly to sanction casual non-observance and flabby ethics.
That's what we call in the business a zinger.
Yeah, right. And you write later that there is no such thing as non-halachic Judaism, that there should be certain things that we have to do. And at the same time, you talk about the way that Rabbi Freehoff describes the Reform Sabbath mood, though you note that he kind of made that up based on, I guess, his anecdotal taking the pulse of Jews in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It wasn't like he did a survey of what was the Reformed Jewish mood. And I guess sort of the question that I have is, from a spectrum of you shall, no ifs, ands, or buts, or as the tradition might say, you may not deviate to the right or to the left, to the idea of halakha as suggestion, or to the idea of where Jewish law fits in the autonomous choices that a Reformed Jew might deliberately engage. Where does ought begin? Where does should begin? How do we know to what degree we are obligated as Reformed Jews with regard to things like Shabbat observance or other elements of halakha?
We develop that sense of obligation clearly by participating in Jewish life as individuals and as members of communities, and becoming part of this participation, part of this life of the community. We become attached to something greater than ourselves, something that we'll call Jewish tradition, which teaches us that authenticity, that is, this thing that draws me to fulfill a sense of personal meaning, or destiny, if you will, is something that is greater than me and located in a common set of ideals, principles, rules, and practices that my people have been undertaking for a very long time. Now, this does not sit perfectly well with the doctrine of autonomy, which is central to Reform Judaism, certainly as it is today. Autonomy meaning that I get to make my own rules. I get to make my own decisions, which sounds like there's nothing that limits my freedom of choice. I can do whatever I want, and therefore Judaism is okay with that because, after all, I have autonomy. The quote from Professor Borowitz that you read and that I have in the introduction of my book expresses the fear that maybe with this doctrine of autonomy, for some Jews, we have created a monster because they take that idea to its a logical extreme, if you will, and say, okay, that means I can do whatever I want or not do anything. And whatever I don't do is sanctioned, approved by the Reform movement. What Freehoff came along to say was that, it doesn't really work that way. If you look at what Reform Jews do, if you look at the way we live, not simply what we talk about in our philosophical or theological writings, but you look at how we practice our Judaism day by day and week by week, you'll see that the way we pray, the way we observe Shabbat and the festivals, the way we conduct various ceremonies of the life cycle, and even the way we understand and interpret the principles of Judaism and apply them outward into the world in various kinds of ethical and social behaviors, all of this material, all of this practice is rooted in the tradition of halakha, of Jewish law. When I say there's no such thing as a non-halachic Judaism, that the Reform movement, to the extent that it is recognizably Jewish, roots its practice in the halachic tradition. It always has. Probably, I can't really predict the future, but I'm gonna suggest that it always will, simply because of that sense of obligation, of responsibility that comes with identifying oneself and one's community as Jewish. Right? This is where I find meaning. And if I find meaning there, then I am somehow responsible for taking a look at what that tradition tells me, of placing myself within it, of making adjustments and changes that I or my community think are necessary. But all in all, living our lives as continuers, as individuals and communities who are carrying on that tradition, picking up where some of our non-progressive Jewish co-religionists have left off, and moving ourselves from the present into the future. So that sense of obligation simply comes from the fact that we're serious about our Judaism, and we want to be able to understand our lives in accordance with how Jewish tradition has come to be.
So it's kind of like, when you think about what makes morality, right, for a free person, right? If someone's not free, your conditions of life are imposed on you. You don't get to choose, right? That's the nature of what it is to not be free. So if you're free, right, then morality is a question of self-restraint or personal compulsion, right? I could do that, but I'm not gonna because it's wrong. Or I don't really want to do that, but I'm gonna because it's right. That's sort of the definition of what it is to be a moral agent. So if you decide that it's important to be a moral agent, that it's important to be good, and that you are committed to being a human being that wants to live in a moral framework, because I think for some people that's not an obvious step, right? For other people, it's how can I maximize what's good for me and only me or those closest to me, and I don't really care much about the rest. But if we decide that we're going to live in that kind of a moral framework, then we say, okay, well, I'm a Reformed Jew, so I'm going to live my life. I'm going to determine my moral obligations through the lens of what Judaism teaches, which is halakha. And by learning what Jewish law has taught around certain questions, then I am free, based on what I learn from those conversations and from that learning to take on for myself obligations. And I will restrain myself or obligate myself, depending on the side of that moral question on which I find myself, to do what is good for me or good for the world or just simply good. And I think that's kind of how Jews play. It's not I don't do it because I have to. I do it because I have to, right? It's an internal compulsion. And so, as you've studied all of these great questions as reflected in the responsa literature, do you find that for yourself as an individual Jew, that you engage in that same sense of revelatory experience of, aha, now I know why I do what I do, or now I know why I'm not gonna do what maybe I used to do? In all of your years of studying and teaching these different texts and these different questions, sort of what did that do for you individually as a Jew?
Just picking up on something you said about a minute ago, we talked about how being a moral person necessarily involves restraint, that you autonomously choose of your own free will to be a good person. And that choice involves restraint because there are certain accepted rules and principles about how moral people act. That's a way of thinking that we all accept. The hard thing for many Reform Jews over the generations has been to try to transfer that kind of thinking into the area of ritual observance. We accept that we have to be good and righteous people, and therefore there are lots of things we're not supposed to do. But when it comes to ritual life, where is the sense of obligation? Again, the sense of obligation is once I choose to be a Jew, once I choose to be serious about my Jewish life, then that choice implies authenticity. It implies becoming part of an ongoing tradition of study and interpretation. And it requires standing within a certain set of practices, a certain way of structuring one's life that we Jews have constructed over the centuries in response, as we say, to the call of Sinai. So, in terms of ritual life as well, an autonomous free choice to be a Jew necessarily involves some kinds of restraint. I'm going to do it this way and not some other way. I could do it another way, but Jews don't do it that way. And I find meaning because I am a Jew and serious about being Jewish. I tend to find meaning in the way that Jews have done it. I can make some adjustments. I can make some changes. We do that all the time in Reform Judaism, but we start from the standpoint of the tradition, from the response of the tradition, and then we move ourselves along in accordance with how we, in terms of our thinking, in terms of our conscience, understand our obligation. So, talk about my experience. Whenever I study the halakha, whenever I see how Jews have tried to define what it means to be Jewish in any specific, what it means to live a Jewish life in any specific context, what I see is enormous creativity. What I see is people, well, usually rabbis, those are people writing these texts, wrestling with either questions sent to them by other people, and therefore maybe they're writing responsa, or maybe they're writing something for their own learning, trying to find a place for their own lives and their own situation within a world of text that was written centuries ago and obviously didn't know about them and their own situation in the future. But it's that activity of interpretation, of adjustment, of application of the text and principles and the definitions that we find in this ongoing tradition. It's that updating of what we have received that is the great creative joy that I find when I sit down to read halakha, when I sit down to try to answer a she'elah, a question that somebody might have about how do I do this or what should I do in this situation Jewishly. It's a fascinating process. It's humbling. You're working with texts of Torah that are sacred. You didn't write them. You consider them sacred, but they're demanding to be interpreted. And that means you have work to do.
When we look at what it is to be Jewish, right? We live in this Western culture where it's taught from mostly, in some ways, a Christian perspective of you got to formulate your belief and then your belief should drive your action, as opposed to the way Jews have looked at the world for several thousand years, which is do what the tradition tells you and that will help you form your belief. You will do the mitzvah, the commandment, and then you will, through that, get to know the mitzvah, the commander, which in a Western culture is kind of counterintuitive. But what I hear you saying is engage with the tradition, explore the tradition, live even by the tradition, and then you will learn how to adapt the tradition in the most meaningful way to your life from an autonomous place. And in your book, you explore that in a whole variety of different kinds of questions, many focused on ritual life, like the question of can we read Torah on Friday night? And it was interesting that that was your first chapter because Temple Bethel of Boca Raton, where I serve, has read Torah on Friday nights for decades. It's a part of our standard practice. But then it gets into other questions around identity, around memory. Can I use quote unquote defective Holocaust scroll that may be puzzle? It may not be fit for ritual use from a traditional definition, but because of its history and its sanctity and its symbolic meaning may have more resonance. That was such a fascinating series of questions about Shabbat observance, about how do I integrate my Jewishness and my care for the modern state of Israel with my American identity and my love for the United States as a citizen or Canada, depending on where my home is and how I represent that in the synagogue with flags on the bima. How do I integrate the secular culture with which I engage with the Jewish culture that I treasure? All of these questions. And I think that engaging with the tradition also helps us realize the religious nature of how we answer some of the fundamental questions that we face today. So, for example, in the state of Florida, there was a very restrictive law passed by the legislature that prohibits a woman terminating her pregnancy after 6 weeks of gestation. And this coming fall, there is a ballot question to restore the right of a woman to choose if and when she might terminate a pregnancy. And when we look at the sources of Jewish tradition that have talked about when does life begin, how does one determine precedence when it comes to the rights of a fetus versus the rights of its mother, and all of those moral questions, exploring what the tradition has to say over centuries, recognizes for us that even the modern questions around terminating a pregnancy have halachic bearing, and that the reason why we need to restore these rights is as a matter of religious liberty, so that people can choose to exercise halachic guidance by virtue of how they read the sources and not be restricted by one reading that is imposed on them by the state legislature. But my question, sort of as we get ready to conclude, is there's so much critique of reform as pick and choose Judaism. What some would say is if you are not, they would say, shomer mitzvah lechol davar, meaning you don't completely guide your life in totality by halakha, you're not really an authentic Jew. Can you talk a little bit about whether that's a fair critique, or about how should a Reform Jew engage with halakha, use halakha in a proactive or even obligatory way to construct their ritual life or their moral life?
Is Reform Judaism a kind of pick and choose Judaism, which is, by the way, it's a pejorative term. It's obviously, it's a way of taking the word autonomy and freedom of choice and turning it into something that, with a negative sound. But it's a good phrase because it suggests, pick and choose suggests, I'm just doing what I like and I'm not really seriously, I'll do this, I'll do that, because I'm not seriously engaged in the process of interpretation, of wrestling with sources, of letting Torah and halakha influence the way I approach my Judaism. If one is simply picking and choosing because I like this feels good, whatever, that does give you a sense of non-seriousness. And in that sense, I don't think that's what autonomy and freedom of choice are supposed to mean for us. They don't have to mean that for us. Reform Judaism as a serious understanding, a serious approach to Jewish life. Reform Judaism simply says, look, we recognize that individuals have to play a key role in determining what it is they are going to do, how they're going to practice their religion. But as individuals, as freely choosing individuals, we are also Jews. And at the same time, as we are free, we wish to make choices that are authentically Jewish or Jewishly authentic, take your pick, which involves an ongoing relationship with the tradition. That involves more than simply saying, I like this mitzvah, I don't like that mitzvah. It means recognizing that there may be some serious moral problems that we have vis-a-vis certain traditional mitzvot, some of which are no longer observed at all. Like we have a problem with this idea of sacrificing animals. Some of which our Orthodox neighbors, for example, still observe. We may have a problem with some of those. For example, the idea that men and women have different ritual roles in the community, that people of certain sexual orientations, certain gender identities are excluded from participation in Jewish life. Our understanding, our basic moral understanding, rejects those distinctions and welcomes everybody in. We, as Reform Jews, we start the process of interpretation from where we are, which I suppose is how everybody starts any process of thinking. I am who I am because I belong to a particular culture. I'm heir to a certain set of values. I don't have to apologize for that. What I need to do then is to take the me, the us, from where we are at the moment, and then enter into this ongoing conversation and argument that we call the tradition, and become open to what that tradition has to say, and to make our choices in light of what we truly believe this tradition is teaching us. And in that sense, the choices we make are not the result of pick and choose, flip a coin kind of thing, but are the outcome of a serious process of wrestling with what this tradition means to us today.
And I love how you add in the conclusion to your book that Reform Jewish thinking does not constrict what we are able to say. On the contrary, the halakha offers us material we can use to craft creative and authentically Jewish answers to the questions of our time. So I encourage everyone to please get yourself a copy of this wonderful book, Reading Reform Response, A Jewish Tradition, Reform Rabbis, and Today's Issues, which is published by the CCAR Press. It not only has really fascinating explorations of these questions, but also the opportunity to read these responsa, this beautiful literature that has come and evolved in our tradition. Rabbi Mark Washofsky, Dr. Washofsky, as all of your students call you, what a pleasure. Thanks so much for being with us today. The Essential Questions podcast has been made possible by the Temple Beth El Jewish Ideas Incubator, committed to creativity and innovation in modern Jewish life. Many thanks to our production team, Jason Reeser, Amanda Brentzel, and Susan Stallone. You can find this podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, and the Podbean app, as well as on Temple Beth El's website, tveboca.org/essentialquestions. Share this podcast with your friends, rate us on Apple Podcast or Spotify to spread the word. And we want to know, what are your essential questions? Let us know by emailing us at eq@tveboca.org. I'm Rabbi Dan Levin, and thanks for listening to the Essential Questions podcast.